The dropship door hissed open with a metallic groan, releasing a wave of scorching air into the hold. The cadets flinched. Outside stretched the endless expanse of Barath 9, an ochre-hued desert world wrapped in dry heat and an eerie silence that preceded death. The sky above shimmered in tones of burnt orange, already beginning to churn with the whispering tremors of an approaching sandstorm. The instructor's voice crackled over the intercom, devoid of emotion. Survival evaluation commence. Duration, 24 standard hours. Extraction coordinates will be transmitted to your implants. All cadets are required to reach the pickup point on foot. Fail to arrive, fail the exam. Mason Ridge adjusted the strap on his supply pack, his throat dry before he even stepped off the ramp. His uniform consisted of a simple, breathable tunic, cargo trousers, and a pair of thermal boots. No rebreather, no visor, no suit, just cloth, skin, and nerve. He glanced to his left. Ursula of the Vexarii slithered forward, her translucent scales already glimmering with the thin, hydrophobic shield gel secreted through her skin. Her nostrils sealed shut with a twitch, replaced by inner filters. Behind her, Tharnok of the Karg huffed, his tusked face buried under a pressurized breathing dome, his thick hide vibrating faintly from internal oxygen circulation. Mason got stares, not the curious kind, mocking ones. The human, again, had been given the primitive protocol, as the other species called it. No tech, no aid, just himself. The Academy claimed it was to level the playing field. In reality, Mason suspected it was a sadistic tradition. Humans, known for survival instincts, were often forced to demonstrate them the hard way. Every time. As the cadets descended into the sand, the instructor drone hovered overhead and broadcast the countdown. Stormfront in T-minus 40 minutes. Proceed. The sun had a cruel intensity here. There was no breeze, only the feeling of something pressing against the skin from all directions. The first kilometer was straightforward, the terrain a shifting patchwork of loose gravel and shallow dunes. Mason walked with measured steps, conserving energy. The others fanned out, many taking advantage of their species' unique mobility. Two Salkan twins activated their glider membranes and soared briefly over the sands. The insectoid pilot Zekra skittered ahead with 6 legs, punching the sand in rapid succession. Only Mason walked. After 20 minutes, the wind began to pick up. Dust started crawling along the ground in horizontal streaks. The color of the sky deepened, as if bruised by something unseen above the clouds. Mason paused atop a low ridge, shielding his eyes. In the distance, the wall of the storm had begun to form, a rising column of whipped sand stretching hundreds of meters into the air, shifting like a living beast in slow motion. He exhaled slowly. Right on schedule, he muttered to himself. At that moment, a voice came through his personal comlink, barely more than static. This is Cadet Tharnok. Visibility already dropping. Filter integrity at 87%. Continuing forward. Mason had no filters. No comm relay in his helmet. No helmet at all. He only had a stitched hood folded into his tunic collar and the contents of his pack. 2 water packets, a foil blanket, 1 nutrient bar, a cutting tool, a flare, and a basic emergency beacon. He knew better than to trigger the beacon. That was a mark of failure, and worse, shame. He scanned the area, looking for anything that might offer shelter. In the near distance, he saw a formation of dark rocks, eroded, leaning slabs half buried in the sand like the ribs of some long, dead beast. He adjusted course and moved toward them. The wind grew louder by the minute. Grit bit at his arms and cheeks, already latching onto his sweat and clumping against his skin. Mason pulled his hood up and tied the ends beneath his chin, but it did little. Sand began to fill the air, not just skimming across the ground, but hanging, suspended, turning daylight into sepia haze. The temperature dropped slightly as the sun disappeared behind the first wave of dust. He quickened his pace. By the time he reached the rocks, it had become difficult to see beyond 10 meters. The wind howled. He ducked behind one of the slabs, kneeling, his pack clutched to his chest. He'd made it to a temporary shelter, but the storm was just beginning. Across the dunes, other cadets were struggling. Through fleeting glimpses between gusts, Mason spotted one of the Salkan gliders dragging himself along the sand, his wings shredded. Another figure, Jersel perhaps, crouched behind her shield dome, but the system sputtered, her luminous shield flickering against the abrasive chaos. Mason knew they had relied on tech. Tech wasn't built for this level of raw elemental force. He also knew he couldn't waste time watching. He turned his attention to his own survival. He opened the water packet and poured a small amount onto his undershirt, then wrapped it around his face, tying it tightly at the back. It wasn't perfect, but the damp cloth would help trap the dust before it reached his lungs. He wrapped his socks around his hands, pulling the boot's cuffs over them to seal the edges. He tied the foil blanket across his upper back and chest, securing it with the pack straps to form a wind barrier. Lastly, he took the belt from his trousers and cinched it around his waist again, this time over the foil to keep it from flapping. Everything now was about minimizing exposure and preserving strength. He lowered himself to the sand, tucking his knees into his chest and resting his head sideways against the inside of the stone. From this position, the worst of the wind would pass over him. His heartbeat slowed. The sound of the storm filled his ears, rushing, screaming, relentless. But Mason knew that panic wasted oxygen and water. Calm was survival. His thoughts drifted briefly. Earth, Utah. The canyon trails where his father used to take him hiking. The desert doesn't hate you, his father once said. It just doesn't care. Respect it, and you'll walk out. Mason closed his eyes, hearing the storm slam into the rocks overhead. No one was coming to help him. And he didn't need help. All he needed was time and the grit to make it through. Mason awoke to pain in his sinuses. The air was so thick with grit that even his dampened cloth filter could no longer keep the burning dust from creeping in. His throat was raw. Every breath scraped. He shifted his weight slightly, feeling the ache in his legs where the sand had begun to weigh down the foil wrap he had strapped to his thighs. For a moment, he wondered how long he had dozed off, but the light hadn't changed. The storm hadn't lessened. If anything, it had grown angrier. He blinked against the sting and peered out from his rock shelter. Visibility had collapsed to less than 3 meters. The wind screamed through the gaps in the stones like it was alive, searching for weakness, howling to find flesh to flay. Grit and heat swirled with no pattern, no rhythm, just chaos. He adjusted the cloth around his face again, tugging it tighter. The fabric was crusted with salt and dust now, but the moisture had helped. He removed the second water packet from his pack and poured a few drops onto the fabric. Not too much, just enough to refresh the barrier for another hour, maybe less. He would have to conserve the rest of it. There was still no telling how far the extraction point really was, and he hadn't received any updated coordinates. The implant in his neck buzzed occasionally, but the signal was inconsistent at best. The storm was blocking transmissions. Somewhere to his left, through the wall of airborne grit, a sudden crack rang out. A mechanical snap, followed by a shriek. Mason froze, listening. The wind made it hard to localize the sound, but he knew the tone. Something had failed. Badly. Then he heard it again. Not a machine. A voice. Choking, coughing, screaming. He hesitated. It wasn't his problem. This was a solo evaluation. Interference wasn't forbidden, but it wasn't rewarded either. If another cadet was down, that was her test to fail. But Mason wasn't wired that way. He pressed his back to the rock, gathered his pack, and crawled out into the storm. The sand hit like knives. Every inch of exposed skin stung. The wind tried to push him back with each step. He crouched low and moved sideways, dragging his legs through the dunes. He followed the sound, listening for gaps between the gusts. He saw her slumped beside a broken pod girassol. Her shield unit had shattered, its filaments splayed like glass threads across the sand. Her body was curled, her face smeared with blood and dust. Her outer membrane shimmered faintly, struggling to produce the protective gel her species relied on, but it was failing. Her gills fluttered uncontrollably, wide open to the storm. Mason reached her and dropped to one knee. She tried to speak but coughed violently, a wet rattle deep in her chest. He opened his pack and tore the foil blanket loose, using it to wrap her upper torso. It was flimsy, but better than nothing. She grabbed his wrist. Her fingers were cold and twitching. Too dry, she rasped. He knew. Vexeri needed ambient moisture. Her species evolved in oceanic vapor zones, not death-world deserts. Her gills were drying out. She was suffocating, not from the dust, but from the air itself. He took a risk. He pulled his remaining water packet, bit the top off and let a stream of it trickle over her neck and chest. Her gills pulsed. Her skin darkened from silver to blue-green. She took a long, shuddering breath. "Don't move," he said. "I'll carry you." She shook her head weakly. "You'll fail." "I'd fail if I left you," he replied. He slung her over his back, using the belt from her emergency kit to secure her arms across his shoulders. Her frame was light denser than a human's, but not heavier. Her species was built for fluid motion, not load-bearing. The wind caught them again. He hunched forward, shielding her with his body, and pushed toward the direction he remembered as uphill. The rocks had been near the edge of a dune ridge. If he could reach the top, he could orient himself. Each step was a battle. His boots sank deep into the sand. The muscles in his thighs burned. The weight on his back grew heavier with every gust, not because she had changed, but because the storm made every movement cost more. His heart pounded against his ribs. He could barely see. Then, ahead, a shape, a figure, larger, broader. Karg. Tharnak stood waist-deep in a collapsed dune pocket. His legs locked, his helmet cracked. His breathing dome pulsed weakly. His tusks had sand stuck to them. His massive arms flailed once, then went still. Mason trudged closer. The dome on Tharnak's head was fractured, and his oxygen system sputtered irregularly. His species wasn't as fragile as Jersal's, but he couldn't survive without the pressurized blend his body needed. Mason didn't hesitate. He couldn't carry both, but he could fix one. He set Jersal gently down in the sand and opened Tharnak's chest unit. The pressure release was jammed. Mason took out his cutting tool and pried the seam open. A hiss of stale air erupted. He cleared the vent holes, then wrapped part of the broken foil blanket around the gap to create a barrier against further sand intrusion. Tharnak gasped. His eyes opened wide. For a moment he looked ready to strike, not recognizing who stood over him. "It's Mason," he shouted. "You passed out. You're overheating." Tharnak blinked slowly, then gave a single nod. He tried to speak, but Mason shook his head. "Don't waste air. Sit still." He turned back to Jersal. Her eyes were closed, but she was breathing. Her gills fluttered with regular rhythm. He could carry her the rest of the way to shelter. "Can you walk?" Mason called out. Tharnak grunted and shifted, pushing himself upright with a groan. He limped forward. "Enough," he rasped. Mason motioned toward the rocks. "We're going there. Stay close." Together, they moved. 3 silhouettes pressed against a world gone mad. The rocks reappeared like ghosts through the storm wall. Mason guided Tharnak into the largest crevice and laid Jersal down again inside a hollow formed by overlapping slabs. He sealed the entrance as best he could using debris and the shredded remains of his pack cover. Inside, the wind dimmed. The sound was muffled now, still present but distant. Mason dropped to the ground, panting, muscles trembling from exertion. He looked over at Jersal. Her eyes were open, unfocused, but alive. Tharnak leaned against the stone, every breath like a rumble in his chest. None of them spoke. There was no triumph yet, no reward, just breath and blood and silence. Mason closed his eyes. He would not sleep, not yet, but he would rest, because the storm wasn't over, and the extraction point was still waiting. Mason lay on his back for only a minute before the full weight of responsibility began to press against his ribs more than the storm ever could. The makeshift stone chamber was sheltering them for now, but it was no long-term solution. The sand had already begun to pile against the outer crevices. Eventually, it would bury them alive. What was a refuge had started turning into a tomb. He sat up, rubbed his eyes with the back of his wrapped hand, and glanced toward Jersal. Her chest still moved. Her gills pulsed, though slower now. She looked fragile in the half-light, her slick scales dimmed under layers of dust and fatigue. She had one arm pressed against her abdomen, protecting it instinctively, though there had been no visible wound. Her survival instinct was strong. That gave him hope. Tharnak leaned against the opposite wall, both eyes closed but not unconscious. The occasional twitch in his fingers revealed he was still alert, conserving energy like a seasoned soldier. Mason respected that. The big Karg wasn't the type to beg or panic. He endured, silently. Mason's gaze shifted to the faint sliver of light filtering through the cracks above. Outside, the wind screamed without pause. Sand shifted like waves over stone. The storm showed no signs of weakening. He checked his chrono. 10 hours remained. 10 more hours in this unforgiving furnace of dust and heat. They couldn't stay exposed, not this close to surface level. The shelter was temporary, barely enough to shield them. He knew the sand would eventually sweep over them completely. If the air pockets vanished, or the heat built up under the debris, they wouldn't wake up again. Not all problems could be fought head-on. Some had to be survived by vanishing into the dirt. He stood, wincing as his back cracked from the strain. Then he walked to the narrowest section of the shelter and began digging with his hands. The stone gave way to packed sand. Not the loose kind, but compressed by time and pressure, hard as cement. He pulled out his cutting tool again. The blade was dulled, but it would do. He began to slice, chip, and scrape. Each movement was slow, deliberate. The storm had drained his strength, but motion gave him purpose. Thornock stirred. "What are you doing?" he muttered. "Digging down," Mason said without looking up. "We'll suffocate, not if I shape the chamber right." Thornock didn't reply immediately. Then, with a grunt, he leaned forward and began crawling toward the far side of the shelter. "Digging helps muscles stay warm," he said. Together they worked. Mason focused on the central downward shaft, while Thornock hollowed out a second side chamber for airflow. The trick wasn't to burrow deep, it was to carve a stable hollow just low enough beneath the surface to remain protected while maintaining a breathable path upward. It needed to be a wedge, not a tunnel. Sweat poured down Mason's face. His hands were raw, and the skin beneath his improvised gloves had begun to blister. Still, he pressed on. The deeper he went, the cooler it became, just a few degrees, but noticeable. The sand took on a dampness near the base, almost clay-like. That was good. That meant the structure would hold its shape. An hour passed, then another. The light above had faded to nothing. The entire shelter was now buried. Mason paused, adjusted his scarf, and listened. It was quieter. Not silent, but less violent. The pressure outside had changed. The storm was passing over their buried location like a blind giant lumbering through fog. He turned toward Jersel. She hadn't moved much. Her body was still curled tightly. He crawled to her side and poured the last drops of water from his packet onto the cloth at her gills. She twitched, her breathing deepened. She opened her eyes slowly. "You're still digging," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "Not much else to do." "Smart," he nodded. "The Academy never mentioned what to do if the storm traps you completely. I guess they assumed we'd be dead by now." "They underestimate," she said. Her voice cracked. Mason placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "Rest. The deeper we go, the longer we survive." Jersel closed her eyes again. Her body still trembled occasionally, but she was stable. For now, that was enough. He returned to the dig site. The hole was almost shoulder deep now. The angled tunnel allowed warm air to rise while cold settled near the bottom. He shaped the sides into smooth curves to avoid collapse and widened the base into a bowl-shaped pocket large enough for 3 to lie side by side. It wasn't elegant, but it was shelter. Thornock joined him again, his breath slow and heavy. "You trained for this?" he asked. "No," Mason said. "Just remembered what my father taught me. Earth deserts, old ways. You're a death worlder. It shows." Mason paused. "Does that mean anything out here?" "It does now." The big Karg lay back against the tunnel wall and closed his eyes. His breathing was stronger. Whatever pressure had built inside his dome earlier had stabilized. He had adapted. Mason slid into the base of the chamber and pressed his back to the sand. His whole body ached. Every muscle felt like it had been hammered. His lips were cracked and his vision blurred at the edges. But inside the hollow, the air was cooler. The sand blocked the shriek of the wind. For the first time in hours, he felt like he could breathe without tasting iron and dust. He looked upward through the narrow vent shaft. The stars were gone. Only a solid layer of storm cloud sand remained. No moonlight, no celestial landmarks. But there was a faint change in the air pressure, a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but there. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to center himself. His heartbeat slowed. In this silence, he could hear more than noise. He could hear breath, his own, Jersel's, Thornock's. 3 distinct rhythms, 3 lives, still beating, still here. That was enough. He would wait until the wind died completely, then he would dig them out. Then he would move. The extraction point might be distant, but he knew the direction now. His internal compass, strained but intact, gave him that. Mason let his head rest against the wall of the chamber. He didn't sleep. He endured. Mason opened his eyes to silence so deep it pressed against his ears like thick cloth. At first he couldn't tell if the storm had ended or if he had gone deaf. The darkness inside the sand hollow was complete. His lungs pulled in air that was dry but no longer heavy with dust. The constant hiss of grit scraping stone had faded. He sat up slowly, listening. His hands reached upward, feeling the ceiling of packed sand above the shaft. It was still solid, but lighter than before. The storm was retreating. He reached into his pocket and found his emergency flare, still intact. He cracked it, and a soft orange glow spilled into the chamber. The light revealed Jersel, curled in the same position, but her eyes were open, alert. Her gills fluttered at a calm rhythm. The moisture he had given her had lasted long enough. "You're awake," she whispered. "So are you," he replied, his voice hoarse. She managed the faintest smile. "I thought I was dreaming. Everything was quiet." "It is," he said, looking toward the shaft. "I think we survived the worst." Tharnok stirred nearby, the flare's light glinting off his thick skin. He pushed himself upright with a grunt and wiped his eyes. "Time to dig out?" Mason nodded. "I'll go first. If the sand collapsed, we may need to clear a new tunnel." He passed the flare to Tharnok, then began climbing the slope of the tunnel. The packed sand resisted at first, but the upper layers had dried and loosened from the passing wind. With care, he pushed his hands upward, pressing against the weight above until light filtered in through the cracks. Pale sunlight, not harsh, not red, but a soft, yellow-white. The kind that followed after a storm had broken its back. He cleared a gap just large enough to squeeze through, then pulled himself up and out into the open. The world had changed. The landscape was unrecognizable. The dunes had shifted completely. Half the rock formations were buried under mounds of wind-carved sand, and the few that remained looked like alien sculptures eroded by time. The air was still hazy but breathable. The silence above ground was vast and haunting, like a battlefield abandoned by both armies. Mason stood slowly, brushing sand from his shoulders. His eyes scanned the horizon. In the far distance, he saw the ridgeline that marked the edge of the storm zone. If his memory served, the extraction point would lie just beyond it, but the terrain was twisted. What had been flat hours ago was now broken by new slopes and valleys. Behind him, Tharnok emerged, his chest rising and falling with heavy effort. He blinked against the light. "We made it," he muttered. Jersel followed shortly after. Mason helped her up, careful to support her arm. She was weaker but upright, her posture straighter than before. Her color had returned to its natural shimmer. "Where's everyone else?" she asked. Mason looked around. There were no visible bodies. No movement, just sand, wind scars, and a few scorch marks from emergency flares or failed shield units. He pointed toward the ridge. "Extraction is that way." Tharnok squinted at the horizon. 5 clicks, maybe 6. 7, Mason said. Storm changed the line of sight. "But we can make it." He gathered what remained of his gear, tattered and clinging to his belt. His pack had lost most of its contents. The water was gone. The only items he had left were a knife, a flare, and a torn piece of thermal cloth. It would have to do. "Let's move," he said, already walking. The sand crunched underfoot. Not soft, not dry. It had been compressed by the weight of the storm and now held the texture of packed salt. Each step left a sharp impression. There was no wind now, just the weight of a sun beginning to rise again. Brighter now, sharper. Mason moved ahead of the others, not out of pride, but to test the ground. The storm could have left sink pockets or collapsed tunnels. He watched his footing carefully. Behind him, he heard Jersel breathing steadily, and Tharnok's heavier steps not far from hers. After the first kilometer, they encountered the first sign of others. A collapsed dome, half melted, its internal gel now hardened into black crystal. Beside it lay a single gauntlet, its claws still clenched. No body. Jersel looked away. Tharnok didn't speak. Mason only paused briefly before continuing forward. In the second kilometer, the heat returned. It wasn't as cruel as before, but it brought fatigue quickly. Mason wrapped his scarf tighter and slowed his pace slightly. Jersel began to lag, and he fell back beside her, offering an arm. She hesitated, then accepted. "You still shouldn't be walking," he said. "I'd rather walk than be carried again." He didn't argue. Pride, when earned, had its place. The 3rd kilometer was rougher. A sudden drop in the sand revealed a collapsed tunnel, possibly an old burrow system. Mason avoided it, signaling to the others. The detour added time, but saved effort. It was Tharnock who spotted the first body. Half buried near a wind-formed ridge, a cadet lay motionless. A tall insectoid from the SAR line. His limbs were curled, his exoskeleton cracked. The heat and pressure had been too much. Mason approached and placed 2 fingers on the creature's throat ridge. No pulse, no breath. He reached down and closed the cadet's primary eyes. "He made it far," he said. Tharnock placed a hand on Mason's shoulder, farther than most. By the 4th kilometer, the sun hung high, and Mason's vision began to blur. He felt the skin on his lips splitting. He reached into his belt pouch and pulled out a crushed tube. Inside was a single emergency nutrient gel. He split it 3 ways. No one spoke while eating it. The taste was foul, but it worked. Jersel stumbled once, and Mason caught her. She waved him off and kept walking. Tharnock said nothing, but adjusted his pace to let her walk in his shadow. When the ridge finally came into view, Mason could see the shimmer of the extraction beacon blinking faintly in the distance. The signal hadn't failed after all, only their ability to detect it during the storm. His legs ached, but he pressed forward, teeth clenched. As they crested the final slope, a drone descended. Its flat surface scanned them with slow pulses, analyzing vital signs and identification tags. "Cadets Ridge, JRCL, Tharnock. Biometrics received. You are within extraction range. Please remain still for retrieval," the synthetic voice intoned. The transport ship touched down moments later. As the ramp extended, Mason let his body finally relax. But instead of walking in first, he turned and held the line. He gestured to Jersel. "You go." She looked at him. "We go together." Tharnock nodded. Agreed. Mason gave a tired smile and stepped on board with them. The hatch sealed behind them. They had walked through a storm meant to break them, and stepped out together, whole. The moment the hatch sealed behind him, Mason felt the world drop from his shoulders. The ship's recycled air smelled sterile and cold, yet to him it carried the fragrance of survival. Inside the transport, the lights cast a pale grue hue over the chamber. Medical drones hummed quietly as they approached, scanning the cadets from head to toe without ceremony. The atmosphere was subdued but alive. He leaned against the inner wall for balance. His knees trembled, not from fear or doubt, but from sheer exhaustion. His body, held together by adrenaline and determination, finally began to acknowledge its limits. His fingers were cracked beneath the cloth wraps, his lips blistered, and his voice hoarse from the dust. Yet his mind was clear. He had done what needed to be done. One of the drones emitted a confirming tone and turned its lens toward the embedded identifier on his forearm. "Cadet Mason Ridge," it said. "Vital signs stable. Damage moderate. Hydration below safe threshold. Muscular integrity compromised but recoverable. Initiating hydration and stabilization protocol." He nodded silently and allowed the drone to press an injector to his neck. A cold wave of electrolytes and anti-inflammatories spread through his bloodstream. He watched Jersel seated on the opposite bench. She held a hydration mask over her face, her gills fluttering gently under the mist. Her skin was regaining its full luster, the marine shimmer returning where it had dulled during the storm. Her eyes were half closed, but when she noticed him watching, she gave him a tired nod. Beside her, Tharnock sat upright, arms crossed over his massive chest, his breathing measured but deep. His pressure dome had been removed, revealing scarring along one side of his cheek from a cracked seal. He didn't complain. His eyes were sharp, fixed on the bulkhead across from him, but his posture was no longer combative. It was the posture of someone who understood who had walked beside him and was willing to honor that in silence. The ship's engines hummed as it lifted off from the desert moon. Through a narrow viewport, Mason could see Barath 9 shrinking below them, its swirling sandstorms reduced to soft spirals of motion. It looked peaceful from up here, almost beautiful, But he knew better. He knew what it tried to do to them. When they landed back at the Galactic Academy complex, the transition was abrupt. The sterile walls of the transport gave way to blinding white lights, rows of medtechs, officers in polished uniforms, and silent observation drones. The cadets were ushered down a corridor toward a debriefing chamber. Mason felt the coolness of the floor beneath his worn boots as a strange comfort. He glanced at Jerzel and Tharnak, walking at his side. No one spoke. No one needed to. Inside the debriefing hall, a circular platform awaited. Dozens of instructors and exam monitors stood in tiers above them, some in military regalia, others in academic robes. A projection hovered above the center, displaying live bioscans, terrain recordings, and survival data for each cadet. "Begin debriefing," said a tall instructor with silver ridges along his temple, a member of the Scenarii, one of the Elder Council races. The voice echoed through the chamber. "Cadet Ridge," the instructor continued, "your file indicates Earth origin, human race. You were assigned primitive survival protocol. No tech, no internal support, is that correct?" "Yes, sir," Mason said, his voice dry but clear. "You completed the course in 22 hours, 31 minutes. You were the first cadet to reach the extraction point alive. You assisted 2 cadets in critical condition, one from the Vexari aquatic lineage, one from the Karg frontal resistance line. Do you confirm?" "I do." The instructor's expression remained unreadable. "Why did you assist them?" "They were alive," Mason replied. "Survival evaluations are individual." "I know." The instructor turned to face the rest of the assembly. Not only did Cadet Ridge survive without assistance or technology, he managed to outlast storm systems that neutralized 21 of the 34 cadets who entered the field. Of those who reached extraction, only 5 arrived unaided. 3 arrived because of Cadet Ridge. There was no applause. The Academy did not applaud survival. It measured, recorded, and archived it. But something shifted in the room. A weight, an acknowledgement. "Cadet Jerzel," the instructor said next, "do you have any statement regarding your condition upon recovery?" Jerzel stood, swaying slightly, but lifted her head. "I would not be here if he had not wrapped my gills. I could not breathe. He gave me water meant for himself. He carried me. No species has done that for mine before." A murmur spread through the upper ranks. Her species was known for its aloof stance, distant from interspecies alliances. Her words, especially in a public chamber, were not given lightly. "Cadet Tharnak?" the instructor asked. The Karg warrior rose to full height. His tusks gleamed under the light. "He fixed my dome, pulled me from a pit. Didn't ask for thanks, just did it. In the sand, you learn who leads. That was him." The instructor paused, then addressed the entire chamber. "Let it be recorded, Cadet Ridge has demonstrated qualities consistent with interspecies command potential. Initiative, adaptive reasoning, and prioritization of others above self-preservation. Hallmarks of leadership on Death World theaters. His performance shall be referenced in future survival protocols across desert biomes." A new projection appeared behind the instructor. Mason's silhouette outlined in red, then blue, then highlighted in green. His actions had been logged, tagged, and now classified under a new Academy doctrine heading: Primitive Ingenuity, Case Study, Alpha. He stood there, silently, unsure how to respond. His mind was still back in the sand, feeling the bite of wind against his face. The chamber felt too quiet, too clean. Later, after the formalities were complete, he walked alone through the dormitory gardens, his uniform exchanged for casual fabric, his boots clean for the first time in days. He sat on a bench beneath a high-arched tree from the planet Elydrus. Its leaves shimmered silver pool in the filtered sunlight. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands clasped. His thoughts didn't rush anymore, they flowed. The test had been cruel. Not because it was unfair, but because it had been honest. The storm hadn't cared about rank, species, or equipment. It had asked only one question: can you survive? He had answered, but what mattered more was that he had answered for others too. Footsteps approached. He looked up and saw Jerzel. She walked slowly but with confidence. Her gills were flushed with color, her breathing mask resting in her hand. She sat beside him. "You weren't supposed to survive," she said quietly. "None of us were. Maybe that's why it worked," he replied. She looked at him for a long moment. Some say strength is armor, or tech, or power. I think it's what you gave us. Mason didn't answer immediately. He watched a group of cadets crossing the far side of the garden. One of them stopped and saluted toward him. Another nodded. He exhaled. If it changed anything, maybe that's enough. It did. He looked at her and smiled, just a little. The weight hadn't left him, but now it felt lighter. Shared, the storm was over. But the lesson remained, and so did the path forward. Basin Ridge, human, Deathworlder cadet, had survived Barroth 9, and in doing so, he had taught the galaxy something it had forgotten. Sometimes, the weakest-looking hands carry the strength to lift others. Sometimes, survival isn't the end of the story. Sometimes, it's just the beginning.